Thank you for joining this morning's seminar. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I'm the Deputy Director of the Latin American Program at the Wilson Center. Worldwide, the United Nations estimates that corruption costs $2.6 trillion per year. That's 5% of global GDP. In highly corrupt societies worldwide, corruption siphons public funds from schools and critical infrastructure. It taints the investment climate. It poisons the public's perception of government. In Latin America, the stubbornly high levels of corruption are notorious. In countries with few controls on corruption, tax evasion, bribery, embezzlement, and cronyism is commonplace and costly. In a 2018 study of public spending in Latin America, the Inter-American Development Bank found that as much as $220 billion, or fully 4% of regional GDP, is wasted annually. And a large part of that waste comes from corrupt public procurement. Experts have drawn attention to this challenge for decades, and key donors, such as the United States, have episodically emphasized the importance of fighting corruption. But if anything, conditions have worsened in recent years, including disappointing backsliding in Honduras and in Guatemala. In its 2019 report, Transparency International said Latin American region had made no progress for 4 years. It cited, among other challenges, rampant misconduct in campaign finance. So clearly, Latin America was poorly equipped to handle the explosion of public spending in response to COVID-19. As governments in the region have rushed to fortify their public health systems and to deliver urgent economic transfusions to struggling economies, significant vulnerabilities have come to light. In May, for example, Bolivia's health minister was arrested for his alleged role in the purchase of ventilators at an inflated price. In Brazil, a Corona Jato task force, modeled after the Lava Jato task force, is now looking into alleged wrongdoing in the management of coronavirus spending, and other similar investigations are taking place at the state level throughout the country. In Colombia, suspected irregularities in the purchase of hospital equipment has led to arrest warrants for 10 mayors. In Peru, senior police officials are under investigation for buying diluted sanitizer and flimsy face masks and gloves for officers. The long list of coronavirus controversies highlights the urgency of improving public procurement and oversight mechanisms, including through reforms that should not wait for a post-crisis review. Our 3 panelists today, Transparency International's chair, Delia Ferreira, former federal prosecutor, Daniel Alonso, an Argentine who is now a partner at Buckley LLP, and my Wilson Center colleague, Daniel Sabet, will help us identify ways to strengthen Latin America's anti-corruption institutions to better confront challenges during and after this pandemic. We'll be starting with short presentations from our panelists, beginning with Delia. After our conversation, we'll address any questions you share on Twitter. So please send us direct messages to @LATAMPROG, that's @LATAMPROG, or tag us in your post. Again, that's @LATAMPROG. I'd like to thank Buckley LLP for its generous sponsorship of this important seminar. And I'd like to thank you again for your interest in this critical issue. We'll begin with Delia, as I said. And Delia, I want to know a bit about the region's context before the pandemic began, which is to say vulnerabilities we were long aware of and what we might have expected the abilities of the region to be in handling this gusher of public spending. And I've already indicated a little bit of the results, but the question is, what were the trends coming in? There actually seemed to be positive momentum for a few years recently. And those who sort of casually watch Latin America might have felt that we were coming in with some useful changes and some crusading public prosecutors, public protests demanding transparency. Was that the case, or were the trends moving in a less favorable direction?
Well, thank you very much for the invitations and for being part of the panel. Of course, the situation in Latin America was not the best one in order to face this kind of crisis, because in emergencies, risk of corruption heighten and increase very notably. And in this kind of emergency, we have a combination of 2 factors which make the situation much more difficult. On the first hand, we have the emergency as such, which authorize or is the excuse for urgency procedures, lack of controls, also a demand from effective, rapid responses from governments, and less attention to corruption or accountability or transparency on the part of the public. And on the other side, the emergency has to do with the health sector. And health sector is one of the most prone sectors in public policy to corruption. In normal times, it is estimated by our group on health and corruption that more than $500 billion a year are lost in corruption normally in the sector of public health, supplies, medicines, etc. So imagine the combination of urgency plus the sector, which presents a very complicated panorama. Of course, what we have seen is the strengthening of tendencies that were already in the region. According, you have mentioned our CPI, our index, and according to that index, from all the countries in Latin America, only 3 of them rank above the middle of the scale. The scale goes from 100, perceived as transparent in the public sector, to 0, perceived as very corrupt. Only Uruguay with 71 points, Chile with 67, and Costa Rica with 56. These are the only the 3 countries that perform relatively well in the CPI. The rest of the countries are below the middle and approximately around 40, and worst, for instance, Venezuela is the last one with only 16 points. So really, really in a very bad condition. One thing that we have seen this time is that the reports on corruption has been simultaneous with the crisis. Yeah, and this is different from previous humanitarian crises we have seen in the world, like Ebola or the tsunami or some others, where we have seen research on corruption after the crisis was over. This time in March, we start receiving complaints, and we have chapters in 112 countries in the world. We start receiving complaints on corruption cases, even in the most solid and developed countries in the world, Spain, France, UK. And in April, early April, we start receiving complaints and reports on corruption in Latin America. You have mentioned the cases. We have cases in all countries in Latin America, which involve, of course, mainly public procurement, and Daniel will talk about that. Our chapters are working on monitoring public procurement in these countries. But it is not, the situation was not only related to the corruption and the perception of corruption, particularly in the public sector. We have also a region that has faced cases of grand corruption affecting, one case, more than 11 countries in the region, like Lavallato or the Odebrecht case. And we have also seen a lack of trust in institutions, lack of trust in the leadership, and also a disenchantment with democracy. According to the last studies or research or surveys, we have 71% of the population unsatisfied with democracy, which is another complicated element in the panorama. You have to add to that economic crisis or debt crisis in many countries. Argentina, one very, very notorious case on debt crisis, unemployment, inequality in generally, high levels of poverty in the countries, populistic tendencies or authoritarian regimes clearly, and all these things has been enhanced and strengthened during this crisis. Using, for instance, many countries have resort to the tools that were already in the constitutions or in the law referring to emergency measures, decretos de necesidad y urgencia, medidas precautorias, provisional measures, and the declaration of emergency, control institutions, audit institutions in quarantine, parliaments closed, the judiciary closed in many, many countries in the region. So the mechanisms in order to hold power to account are really in a weak position during the crisis. And in authoritarian regimes or populistic regimes, these tendencies has been strengthened. We have also many complaints regarding the reduction of the institutions related to access to information, access to public information, which is the basis in order to hold power to account. So we are facing this problem in many countries, not all, but in many of them. And in fact, the areas of concern has been public procurement in the first place. I will not go into details now. I am sure Daniel will go on that and we can talk afterward. The use of budgetary resources, donations received by countries and how are they managed or where are they ending. Also the programs, social programs created by countries which has been subject to clientelism or conflicts of interest in many countries. And of course, the surveillance tendency in many countries and the restrictions on freedom of expression. In fact, we are seeing what I call an epidemic, which is an increased resource from countries or governments to the use of digitalization of information from citizens in order to control without any care of individual rights, privacy, etc. And in authoritarian regimes, this is very, very risky. We have seen governments controlling social media in order supposedly to avoid fake news or misinformation, but in fact surveilling society, and in some cases real censorship or fight against freedom of the press, which is really shrinking the space for civil society. Another tendency that was already there through laws and regulation, but now it has been increased. So that's the panorama in Latin America when COVID hit our countries. And that's the problematic situation we are facing now. So I will leave it here in order to start the conversation afterwards.
Many thanks, Delia. Very, very useful context and a very good lead into Daniel Sabet, my colleague at the Wilson Center, who has specialized in procurement challenges in Latin America, including but not exclusively in the country of Honduras. Daniel, because public procurement identified by Transparency International and other watchdog groups is such a long-term concern in terms of government corruption, the control of corruption in Latin America, we had hoped that you would share some insights from your research, again, in Honduras and elsewhere, into, again, what was the context going into COVID-19 in Latin America? What should we have expected would occur with the control of all of this new spending that's happening, and as Delia pointed out, happening at a very unusual pace, and whatever safeguards may exist may not be honored given the urgency of the public health emergency. So take it away, Dan.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. I'm going to use slides, so I hope the audience doesn't mind here. But yeah, the first point, and I think Delia highlighted this very well, is that most of the region's corruption scandals have in fact been procurement related. And if you look across the last decade, you can point pretty much in almost every Latin American country to a major procurement related corruption scandal. Lava Jato in Brazil is, of course, the most notable one. $349 million in bribes from Odebrecht alone. But as Delia pointed out, and when we think about the procurement corruption, most of the cases have been in public works kinds of contracts. But right behind public works is the health sector. And so in Honduras, a case I'm going to talk more about, you have the Social Security Institute. Money was about $360 million was siphoned through shell companies and bribes for contracts. So procurement is one of the main forms through which corruption occurs in the region. Whoops. Back there. What Delia was speaking about, this is the average corruption perception index from 2012 to 2019. Now, I don't have all countries here because I'm missing some data on this on the x-axis, but on the y-axis, this is the corruption perception index. As she was saying, Uruguay and Chile and Costa Rica kind of up here towards the top. But in the Central American countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua at the bottom, and some of the other countries here slightly higher up. And I show this to really emphasize that there is considerable variation in the region. And the x-axis here, this is the percent of firms reporting that a bribe is expected in government contracting in the World Bank's enterprise surveys. These are the countries that have had an enterprise survey done over the course of the last 8 years. And you can see there's also considerable variation in this variable here, with Paraguay here on the more extreme case of firms reporting that corruption was required in government contracting, and some of the Central American countries and Uruguay on the opposite end of the scale. So both of these measures have limitations, but it gives a sense of the variation in the region. Now, the keys to effective procurement systems, the main thing is a series of rules requiring competition and limiting discretion. But the other key part of it is that Delia referred to as the transparency and accountability mechanisms. And those can come through multiple sources: internal auditors within institutions, supreme audit institutions, prosecutors, legislative oversight, and civil society and media oversight. Now, in times of an emergency like we're in right now, those rules are heavily relaxed. But that doesn't mean that transparency and those accountability mechanisms need to be relaxed as well. And so what we always say is there's a tension between integrity systems and efficiency in the procurement system, but these things are not mutually exclusive. And so as a result, we've seen countries responding in very different ways. So you have Uruguay that didn't really change their rules much at all. Very little procurement done under exceptional circumstances. So that's kind of, on one extreme. All the other countries in the region have issued kind of emergency proclamations and really relaxed procurement requirements. But then you see encouraging things. So like in Guatemala, for example, there have been efforts to increase transparency. So this is from their website. You can click on this link and it will take you to all of the procurements that have been done under the state of emergency. So you see some efforts to increase transparency. And then in some countries that has corresponded with an increase in accountability actions. Benjamin mentioned at the top the Corona Jato task force. So in Brazil, and so there have been efforts to kind of recognizing that with the relaxing of rules that corruption is going to increase, that we need to increase the activities of those accountability mechanisms. And then you have countries where the requirements were relaxed, but really no significant measures were taken to prevent corruption, and Ecuador would probably be considered a case of that. And procurement problems in times of crisis, I mean, we've been talking about corruption, and that is certainly a big part of it. And corruption officials can certainly abuse their flexibility, the flexibility and the relaxing of the laws for personal gain. But then there's also a lot of what we could call schemers just in society more generally that are abusing the sense of urgency for personal gain. And then we can get collusion between the two. But it is important to mention that there are non-corruption problems as well that we're seeing all the time in procurement in the region, so that procuring goods that aren't necessarily needed, but we're rushing, and so they're procuring them and spending a lot of money. Goods that are needed but don't meet the specifications, expensive items, suppliers that don't have the ability to provide the goods, even though maybe their intentions are good, and governments that don't have the ability to use the goods. So corruption is a major issue, but there are non-corruption problems as well. I want to focus briefly on the case of Honduras and their response to COVID-19. They have relaxed procurement requirements like most countries in the region, and they gave, which was interesting, most of the Emergency Procurement Authority to what was at the time a very well-respected institution, Invest H, which has purchased over $80 million in goods related to the crisis. Investace is very interesting. They emerged as they were originally the Millennium Challenge account in Honduras, set up during the Millennium Challenge Corporation's compact with the country. After the compact closed, MCA continued to operate and then eventually became Investace. And over time, they have gained a lot of authority to conduct procurement primarily in public works. But they were seen as a more technocratic, overseen by a governing board, civil society organization, and kind of seen as a reform tool. And so in the beginning, there was kind of some hope that this would be positive. Some civil society groups were supposed to be providing oversight to the procurement they were doing. But there was a sense in civil society that these groups were a little too close to the government, that they were not going to be adequately critical enough. There was a big pushback in civil society to these emergency procurements. And the result was that the Association for a More Just Society did conduct a social audit of the procurements that had been done by Investace. Importantly, the National Anti-Corruption Commission was not invited to do something similar. It sounds like a government institution, but in Honduras, it's actually a civil society organization. And the ASJ audits, which I'm going to report on some of their findings, are really quite interesting. For some of the things, they found that the procurements were essentially successful. Test kits, for example, they got good prices, good quality, and they were delivered in a reasonable time frame. But they found, and this was kind of surprising, poor documentation justifying the firms that were picked, the prices, the types of kits, that there were no penalties included for late delivery or a lack of quality guarantees. And the procurements worked out, but there was certainly the potential for abuse. And then this is a case where the government capacity wasn't really able to meet the goods that had been procured, so only able to test 500 per day and having procured 250,000 test kits. But from a procurement point of view, not necessarily problematic, but when we move to personal protective equipment, we see a very different situation. Very high prices, which was fine. I mean, that's what was happening in the market. But they selected 5 countries and they were contracted very quickly without a clear rationale. And ASJ's audit found that the issues of inadequate capacity, some of the firms had no government contracting experience. One was in a totally different industry in telecommunications, and one had red flags on it from an existing corruption investigation that's ongoing. And 4 of the 5 orders needed to be canceled when the firms couldn't deliver. 1 of those 5 orders came through 65 days late. That was a total of 75 days from the time of the purchase order. And so the really kind of a failure to provide the personal protective equipment that was needed and needing to canceling contracts. But the real scandal case that has been kind of covering the Honduran media has been mobile hospitals, $47 million for 7 mobile hospitals purchased through a US-based intermediary, supposed to be manufactured in Turkey. ASJ was critical that these weren't necessarily well justified up front. But arguably necessary given the crisis. The issue was there was a multi-million-dollar markup and paid 100% in advance without guarantees or penalties. Arguably, Investace argued at the time that was necessary. However, the date for their delivery came and went. People were already very concerned about this, and then the manufacturer that was supposedly the end manufacturer reported that no order had ever been placed and they weren't working on them. So there's a real risk here. The provider, the US-based intermediary, still claims that these are on their way, that 2 should arrive in mid-July. But this has been a major scandal because $47 million has already been paid, and it's not clear that any goods will be provided. So I think this highlights some of the challenges that the region is facing. It's important to note that procurement was a problem prior to the pandemic, that the relaxation of rules could in theory be offset by increases in transparency and accountability mechanisms. And some countries have responded very well, but Honduras, we can see like other countries in the region as a case where you have likely flawed failure to obtain materials, and particularly bad because Investace was seen as a real reformer, and yet this important reform tool has failed to deliver. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was excellent, Daniel. We'll talk a lot more about what's worked in the region as well, in addition to some of the the backsliding we've seen recently. I want to turn now to Daniel Alonso. Daniel is an expert on many of these issues in Latin America. As I mentioned, he's an Argentine. We're actually turning to him, though, for some outside expertise here and insights and best practices from outside Latin America. In addition to being a partner at Buckley LLP, he's the former chief of the criminal division in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York, and someone who's followed very closely these issues in the United States. So the question is, are there some mechanisms to control public corruption, including but not exclusively in procurement, that we should be considering in a conversation about Latin America's struggles to contain corruption, particularly at this moment? Thank you for being here, Daniel.
Yeah, so thanks for having me very much. I want to clarify that lest people wonder why the U.S. Department of Justice let an Argentine be a federal prosecutor. I'm an Argentine American, so I've been, obviously I grew up in this country, but I do focus. I have looked a lot at what's going on in Latin America. Very grateful for the remarks by Delia and by Dan. So in the U.S., we used to have kind of a, anti-corruption prosecutors used to kind of bat around this idea that you can't prosecute your way to a cleaner government, right? It's a very important piece of a broader anti-corruption strategy. Prosecutors are obviously very important. I was also a state prosecutor, and we used to say in the state prosecutor's office in New York that a crime prevented is always better than a crime prosecuted. So obviously some of the measures that Dan talked about are important. In the U.S., obviously we try to do both things in tandem, right? We have a very strong investigative and prosecution network, but also the government has mechanisms to try to prevent. And just very, very quickly, because I'm sure most of the audience is roughly familiar with the U.S. Anti-corruption, anti-fraud framework. The federal prosecution apparatus, both criminal and civil, by the way, is run by the Department of Justice, and there is a robust civil enforcement authority that the Justice Department has with the False Claims Act and other laws, which allow for a lot of flexibility in the use of our legal tools. And the criminal prosecutors are both based in Washington at the main part of the Department of Justice and in 93 U.S. attorneys' offices around the country. And they work with what people see on TV as the FBI, the IRS, the federal agents who wear raid jackets and they execute search warrants, et cetera. And that's our main sort of prosecutorial framework. And you have to add to that in the United States, since we're a federalist system, we have 50 states, more than 2,000 local prosecutors, 50 state attorneys general. So there's a lot of people out there who wake up every morning and say, I wonder if I can find some corruption cases to go after today. But to sort of answer your main part of the question, I think there's a very important mechanism that we came across, that we created really in the United States in the wake of Watergate in the late 70s as part of a good government wave, which is the federal inspectors general. And the federal inspectors general, it's interesting because there's really no close parallel in Latin America for this. Colombia comes the closest to doing this. An inspector general in the United States it's a figure that has the powers of an auditor to audit contracts and programs, but also the power of an investigator. And for the federal inspectors general, they have almost a dual reporting mechanism to the head of the agency where they work and to Congress. So they have a very powerful reporting obligation, and there are lots of parts of the law that aim to make them independent. Now, it's beyond the scope of today's discussion that there have been some issues going on right now in the United States with the president having fired a few inspectors general, but that's not today's topic. As a general matter, they tend to be an independent group, and their goal is to root out not just corruption, but also waste and fraud and mismanagement. And so far in the pandemic response oversight in the US, we've been fortunate, and it doesn't surprise me, it's mainly been about fraud. We have not yet seen any actual corruption cases come up. They inevitably will, but they're likely to be more sporadic and isolated than the kinds of things we heard about in Latin America. So I'm happy to talk more about inspectors general. I just want to leave with this sort of basic point about them, is that there are more than 70 inspectors general in the federal system. And what's kind of neat about them and makes them very useful, federal prosecutors love to work with IGs, as we call them, is that they are embedded into particular agencies. They don't answer to the agency, so the agency head can't interfere with the investigations by law, but they understand the agency really, really well. And the agency could be a cabinet ministry, a cabinet department in the US, like the Treasury Department, or it could be a subgroup, for example, of the Treasury Department, like the Small Business Administration. And those, I mentioned those because they've been very active in the pandemic response, because the US government has outlaid $2.5 trillion to make loans. So the kind of cases we've been seeing in recent weeks and months have been borrower fraud. They've largely been that and price gouging, fraudulent personal protective equipment, things like that, other stuff which I can talk about if you're interested. But the inspectors general are a crucial part of this. And in fact, again, sort of beyond the scope of this, created additional one special inspector general for the pandemic response, and also an entire committee of inspectors general to oversee the government's response to this. So it's a neat, proactive system that combines auditors and investigators and works quite well when it's done right.
Excellent. No, very helpful. Obviously, in the United States, the inspectors general have been scrutinized lately in terms of the independence from the White House, but in general, I think it has been a really effective institution, and we'll talk more about whether or not it might fit in the Latin America context. Delia, I wanted to return to you. I mean, there's been discussion from you, from Daniel Sabet, about reasons why even positive structures in the region may not be effective right now, because there are these executive orders that Congress may not be functioning, that courts may not be functioning, that civil society may be restricted, as you've pointed out, by the authoritarian tendencies. Before we get to all that, though, I want to stay with the structures themselves. Daniel Alonso has just mentioned the inspectors general as something that's not common in the region. We've not talked about anti-corruption agencies in Latin America that have maybe some of the authorities that would be useful in a moment like this. I wonder if you could talk just for a minute about the history of anti-corruption agencies in Latin America. Are they effective, aggressive enough? Do they have the right powers and independence? Are they stepping up at this moment?
I would say that in general, what we have achieved during this year is to construct or build the legal infrastructure for the fight against corruption, which does not mean that we have implemented those rules in order to be effective in the fight against corruption, because we have seen in many countries what is a tendency to politicize this kind of institutions. So although in the rules, in the books, they are independent from the political authority of the time, the government in office, in fact, they are not. Either they come from the same political party and the authorities are nominated because they are part of the governmental party, the official party, or because they are very sensitive to the political situations. We see in these regions some, even the judiciary, for instance, as the most sensitive institution towards political changes in the countries. So the lack of independence is one of the factors. In other cases, the institutions are created by the budget to that institutions are not provided yearly. So they have the authority to perform, but no resources in terms of human resources, economical resources, technical resources, or the possibility to use digitalization, or let's talk about artificial intelligence, data processing, or machine learning, or things like that. So they don't have the resources to use the authority they have. In other cases, they have parts of the authority, but not the whole. For instance, what we have seen in many countries is the creation of 2 or more institutions that share the fight against corruption from different points of view: internal control, external control, previous control, ex post facto control, anti-corruption, auditing. And what we see when this kind of design is put in place is that there is a competing forces, and this paralyzes the effectiveness of the integrity system. So there is no one model, as Daniel says. The only similar thing to the inspector generals is the case of Colombia, but that's not the case in other countries. And it also, the effectiveness of this institution many times depends on the persons in front of them. So if you have a person which really uses all the resources available in order to perform the work and is not dependent on the political authorities, you may find interesting things. For instance, in Peru, one important process that they are applying is the concomitant audit. So although the authority is the Contraloría General is supposed to work at the end and investigate what happened with the program or a budget line or whatever it is, they are applying an approach which means controlling in the same time as the infrastructure project is advancing or the public procurement is ongoing, in order to prevent and not wait to the end to say, well, there was a lot of problems here, we have to sanction. Instead of applying that, they are using this concomitant, as they call, approach. But it is also the creation of the Controller General. I don't know whether it will remain once the Controller General is replaced for other person.
Thank you, Delia. Dan Sabet, the question we've received, and I encourage other questions to send us again on Twitter. You can send us a direct message at LATAMPROG, or you can tag us in your post at LATAMPROG. Dan Sabet, we've had questions, and you alluded to this earlier, about the need of urgency, particularly in public health procurement right now, and whether it's fair of us to even scrutinize the speed of public procurement when the scale of the health emergency is at this level. So I guess my question for you is, if it is appropriate to move at the speed that they're moving, even if it means circumventing some of these safeguards, what can be done in terms of monitoring, transparency, civil society role, other methods that you've studied in public procurement to limit corruption, even at the speed that we're moving right now to acquire ventilators, PPE, and other critically important mobile hospitals, as in the case of Honduras? What can be done, even if we justify the speed and circumvention of some of the critical structures to monitor public procurement?
Yeah, it's a good question, and like I said in the presentation, there's always a tension between efficiency and integrity. The question is where you kind of find yourself on that continuum. So yes, there's absolutely a need to move quickly. Where we've seen some of the problems in the Honduras case, where these purchase orders were signed the day of or within 2, 3, 4 days, very, very, very quick. Leaving insufficient room for even some basic due diligence. So there is a way to get away from procurements that used to take 6 months and are now taking a day. Well, there's a big space in between those two, right? So there are opportunities to still maintain some basic due diligence while moving quickly. But having said that, recognizing that there is a relaxation of the rules and a need to move quickly, the two things that I mentioned in the presentation, really, you could still be transparent about what and how you're doing it. You can still keep those receipts and document very clearly what you're doing and why you're doing it, and providing clear justifications for doing so. And that can be done even when you're moving quickly. And then that having those accountability mechanisms, or the expectations of those accountability mechanisms, in place. So Delia mentioned something important that's still pretty rare, doing something kind of in real time, that real-time oversight. But even if there is the expectation and the threat, so to speak, that what you're doing now, move quickly, that's fine, but keep your receipts and we're going to check your work afterwards, is a very reasonable thing to be doing. And so it's one of the surprising things with the Investace case, because that makes me wonder if they weren't just bamboozled a bit because because the hospitals aren't being produced, right? So the allegations, if you read the Honduran press, it's all corruption, corruption, corruption. But you have to wonder if there wasn't just a really bad, terrible, terrible mistake. So having that transparency and having the accountability mechanisms, and while still going fast, not throwing all the due diligence and all the requirements out the window in the name of speed.
Daniel Alonso, so you've heard from Delia on some of the mechanisms that do exist in the region, right? It isn't that they haven't thought of this problem. We talked a bit about the anti-corruption agencies and what authorities they may have or may lack, and some of the audit systems in the region. I just wanted to hear more from you, both about inspectors general and whether it would fit in the context of the region and other ways that Latin America might structure its agencies. And I'd love for you to answer in two ways, if you would. One is, what can they do urgently, right? That we're talking about in this conversation, a problem that's happening today with money that's scarce and being siphoned away from critical needs. And then also, I think we have to acknowledge some of this will have to happen after, when we reflect on just how much money was stolen during these emergencies. So maybe sort of urgently and in the long term, how can Latin America learn lessons here? You're on mute. Please unmute. Thanks.
Stepping back for a little framework, some Latin American countries like Argentina have anti-corruption offices, which in some administrations have been very aggressive, but they've always been criticized as being too close to the party. So others, like Mexico, have established a special anti-corruption prosecutor, which is a good thing. We've done that in the US as well. And the problem that Delia mentioned about competition is a problem that we're not unfamiliar with in the United States, right? So we used to say, kind of, if the public only knew, how much there was sort of infighting among federal agencies. But with the idea that I threw out, which is of inspectors general, they know what their lane is. Prosecutors know what their lane is, and the key, and I would do this. You're talking about short term. The key is they work together. The key is they work together as a team, and the inspector general knows that she can't prosecute people in federal court, and the prosecutor knows that he doesn't have access to the employees as readily as the inspector general does, or access to the records, or an understanding of the norms and how things are done. So you have those kind of lanes, and the FBI agents, have to cooperate with the prosecutors, and they do already. I mean, it's a thing of beauty in the United States. One of the greatest things about being a federal prosecutor was working together in these teams. So I think they could do right now, they could say, stop with your bureaucratic, separate, completely separate silos. I mean, in some of these countries, I get told, oh, no, that's the police. They bring that to us. And then it's the prosecutors. Or no, the prosecutors don't really have the same mission we have. Well, that's crazy. I mean, the mission has to be to prevent crime and to prosecute it when they find it. And that works much better when they work more closely together. So if there's an emergency decree that we're screaming out for, it's have the investigators, the auditors, and the prosecutors, including civil, work together. That's what I would say.
And just the way to incentivize that, I mean, a decree ordering better cooperation seems difficult if you're talking about really building norms. Is there anything structural that can promote, I don't know, interagency task forces, some sort of system where, physically.
Well, listen, some of it is culture. So changing culture is hard. Some of it, I'm sure, is legal. I'm sure Delia or somebody knows that there's some legal impediment in a country that doesn't let them work together. For example, in Argentina, the prosecutors, the ministry of the public ministry is theoretically separate from both the executive and even the judiciary. So, they take pride in that, which is great because they're independent. But they shouldn't shy away from working with the very people that are investigating their cases. So to incentivize it is the prize at the end, which is to try to clean up, corruption in your country. It's a big deal.
Delia, so turning to the role of civil society here, you painted a pretty concerning picture of governments that are limiting civil society's space to operate, either through aggressive and potentially legal surveillance, supposedly fighting fake news and misinformation, but actually trying to quash all criticism. Do you have a sense that now, when civil society is arguably needed more than ever to monitor government performance, not only on public health and economic stimulus, but on clean government, that it's able to play this role? I mean, you are the chair of one of the most important global anti-corruption agencies in the world. Is there space right now? Can we call on civil society to do more, or is that space not available?
You can count on civil society, because civil society is working very hard, even in front of these kind of restrictions or attacks on some governments. We have chapters in Venezuela doing anti-corruption work in a very conflictive and complicated situation. But all the countries in Latin America work together at the very beginning of this emergency in the region to prepare recommendations for public procurement particularly. So our chapters in the different regions of the world have been summoning together in order to produce this kind of recommendation according to the context of each region. The first group was the Latin American group. Everything is available on our websites and the websites of the chapters. Individually, what our chapters are doing is monitoring public procurement, creating digital tools to monitor public procurement. For instance, in Argentina, ASJ is the chapter in Honduras, and they have been particularly monitoring this kind of public procurement deals that Daniel was presenting. And for instance, in the case of the hospitals, one of the things that they discovered was that they asked for supplies from the Secretary of Health of the government, especially says, and we have the document, the chapter found the document, say, I am not asking for mobile hospitals. That was one day. The following day, the order for purchase of mobile hospitals was signed. So my point here is some of the non-corruption problems mentioned by Daniel are in fact windows of opportunity for corruption. It's not just that they have bought the wrong tests or they have paid higher prices because of the market. There are many things, particularly in a region where corruption is systemic, where are connected with corruption, although in some other countries it would be policies without analyzing the needs before. In this case, in Honduras, it is clear that this is part of a corrupt or potentially or alleged corrupt deal. So it's not only non-corruption problems. It might be the window of opportunity for that. What we are doing is monitoring, following the cases. In some regions, for instance, the main concern has not been public procurement, but donations received by countries. In others, the main concern has to do with the use of the huge amounts of help or aid from developed countries or from multilaterals to the countries, amounts of money that and resources that are really unprecedented, and they are being monitored by civil society and the investigative journalism. I think that one of the factors that has or the main factors that created this quick awareness and report on corruption in this crisis has to do with the awareness of people of the damage of corruption. What is here at stake is the health of the citizens. It's not just money, or it's not corruption as not a financial issue. Here, the health is the problem. Second, investigative journalism has really developed in our region in the last 10 years. So we have groups of investigative journalists working in international consortium of corrupt investigators, journalists, and also data journalists, which is very, very important, and it is being developed higher in our region. So these factors contribute to this reaction and report of corruption very quickly. So we are working with the press in order to report and highlight and follow this kind of situations, potentially corrupt situations.
Excellent. No, journalists obviously play a critical role. I think you're understating the role that your organization and others like it have played over the years in explaining the actual impacts of corruption, so that it's not a theoretical good governance issue, but really siphons money away from schools, from roads, from education. And in this case, healthcare, you're right, certainly brings home the issue very clearly. I want to remind our audience, you can continue sending questions to us as you've been. On Twitter, you can direct message us, DM us at LATAMPROG, or tag us in your post. Daniel Sabet, we've talked a lot about healthcare. As Delia mentioned, it's arguably the sector most vulnerable to corruption all the time, and particularly the one most affected now. But infrastructure is actually the area we usually think about. Not only Odebrecht, the Lavajato case, but it's where the money is, right? And if you want to steal from government, that's the big spending. I think we'll see in stimulus measures a lot of infrastructure projects in the near future. Are there particular issues we should be focusing on to better fight corruption and infrastructure procurement that maybe we haven't talked about yet in this discussion that's focused to some degree on the public health sector?
Public works is kind of the top source of corruption, and health kind of falls below that, and then it kind of goes down from there. Maybe policing gets to come next, and arguably there have been a lot of movement kind of in the wake of the Lavajato scandal. I mean, almost every country in the region was affected by bribery from Odebrecht. It was a startling wake-up call for action, and there have been a lot of kind of interesting initiatives out there. There's been a big push towards in terms of transparency. The technology is certainly there to where there's procurement platforms that can integrate the whole procurement process, so that information about individual procurements becomes public information and can be accessed and searched. And one of the things that Delia mentioned on the data journalism, there's some really good studies out there now where journalists, academics have literally downloaded massive amounts of procurement data, and through machine learning have been able to kind of pick and find these kind of red flags in procurement. Now, unfortunately, some of the things that they look for are things like, a single bidder, or things that are we wouldn't find in this current context that we're living in right now. But once we get back to kind of a more normal scenario, those are our realities. And so there's a lot of opportunities there with getting that data online, available in a way that can be analyzed using pretty sophisticated techniques in most cases, but can be significant. And there are interesting civil society initiatives. Cost is one in particular, which is Construction Sector Transparency Initiative, I believe it stands for. So, and not just at the kind of the high technical level, but really trying to mobilize local communities to do their own local auditing of construction projects, and trying to make data available about what roads are supposed to be built, where they're supposed to be built, how much they're supposed to cost, when they're supposed to be done, and then empowering kind of citizen local committees and organizations to be able to kind of look and verify that information and audit the work that's being done in their communities. So there is a lot, as always, kind of a lot of interesting things going on. The problem is that the bad guys, as it were, are as equally as creative as the good guys, and will continue to come up with innovative ways to siphon and steal money. So, for example, in the Honduran case, as procurement became more under focus, government officials realized, well, hey, maybe we need to start using procurement, and let's use some other mechanisms to embezzle funds. And so there has been a number of cases that the MOXIE, the Anti-Corruption Commission, that was a success story for its brief history before it was disbanded. We haven't really talked much about the MOXIE or CICIG in Guatemala, but they were investigating several cases where money was being embezzled through nonprofit organizations. They said, we're going to give a whole bunch of money to a nonprofit organization to do social programming, and really these were fake nonprofit organizations, and that money was being embezzled, and some of it was ending up in political campaign accounts. And those investigations were moving forward, and then the Moxie was ended in Honduras, and those investigations have ground to a halt. So there's always new things, new creative ways, and Transparency International, of course, has been a key player in thinking through some of those creative ways. But it's a constantly evolving situation.
Yeah, so you're referring to, of course, to the OAS anti-corruption agency in Honduras, the UN anti-corruption agency in Guatemala, both of which were disbanded, unfortunately, over the last year or so. And we could also talk, you're talking about a lot of bad actors in the private sector. That's something also Daniel Alonso and others might address. We have a few minutes left. The role of companies in trying to address these issues internally as well, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as a tool. What I do want to talk, though, Daniel Alonso, if you would, is about this data issue. We've heard both from Delia, from Daniel Sabet, about the importance of transparency, of public access to information as a way to fight corruption. You've talked about prosecutors, inspectors general, subpoena power. Do you find it's important that journalists can play their role, that there be a access to the public and the Public Information Records Acts, both at state and federal level, to help federal prosecutors investigate, to help state authorities be vigilant?
Well, it's not so much help. It's more, bring matters to their attention. And I assure you, federal prosecutors and inspectors general read the papers every single day. So the role of investigative journalists and reports by civil society are crucial as well. But in terms of data, it's interesting. I mentioned culture before as a way to kind of transform anti-corruption efforts in Latin American government agencies. And one thing about the system that I know here in the United States is that the anti-corruption investigators tend to be pretty proactive. You shouldn't be waiting to see an article about a scandal before you start issuing subpoenas, because then the cat's a little bit out of the bag. Now, you do that, of course, but they're proactive. They look at stuff, and they particularly look at data. Transparency is all great to have transparent data, but there's a lot of data that's not transparent that is available to government investigators. Most significantly, I'd say, is the database held by financial intelligence units in each country of suspicious activity reports of SARs issued by banks. Why don't we cross-reference the procurement databases with the SAR database and see who's bidding on these contracts and what kinds of activity they've been engaged in? People, by the way, inspectors general have been data mining for many, many years. And it's very important. But today, using data analytics tools, you can combine a whole bunch of fountains of data in order to create serious investigative leads. So I would say proactive investigation is very, very important.
Yeah. So Delia, I mentioned the FOIA, the Federal Open Records Act in the United States, right? Do you sense, though, that the kind of data that we really need access to here, as Daniel Alonso is mentioning, is not the kind of data that even a conscientious compliance with these Open Records Acts would provide, that it really does come down to these financial intelligence units, to anti-corruption offices, to inspectors general, if there are such a thing, to auditors?
Of course, we need information, and we need to protect the right to access to information. We have worked in the region for many years in order to have the laws in place, and we have to transform that ineffective. So we cannot put a ban saying this office is on quarantine when you are responsible for guaranteeing that right, and that had happened in many countries in the world and in the region. But one thing regarding what Daniel Alonso was mentioning about the crossing of information and the using of the technology to dig and mine that information has to do with beneficial ownership transparency, for instance. I don't need a register saying that Donald Duck is the owner of this company. I need a register telling me the truth about who is the owner of the company in order to find out whether we are in front of a conflict of interest, undue influence, money and politics, or campaign finance problem. And that's something that is not guaranteed in the region yet. So we have to fight for beneficial ownership transparency. I know that the US has approved a law recently in order to guarantee that, but we have to avoid tax havens as the protection of corrupt networks. And before we end, I would highlight another problem related to corruption, not the big or grand corruption, but petty corruption, the corruption that affects one-to-one. And it is clear in this kind of COVID situation, not only in the countries in our region, but even in developed countries, that when resources to provide assistance to the people ill are restricted or are scarce, there is an opportunity for those deciding who is going to use the ventilator, who is the only ventilator missing, who is going to receive the treatment, who is going to be tested. And we are seeing this kind of corrupt deals, typical bribery issues one-to-one in this kind of situation. And it really affects the most poor and unaffected people, or the less resourced people in society, and that's the risk we have to pay attention to.
Many thanks. In our last 2 minutes here, we'll start with you, Daniel Sabet. Again, among this menu of options in the very short term to try to slow the pace of corruption, what should be prioritized? Just in 30 seconds.
Goodness, it's the transparency accountability mix. I mean, you need both of them.
Yes, Daniel Alonso, same question for you in the very short term.
We didn't talk about incentivizing the corporate sector. So very briefly, countries have to do whatever they can, like the United States has done in a very strong way since 1999, to make sure that corporations have mechanisms to try to prevent their own involvement in corrupt activities with government agencies. Very, very important.
Excellent. Delia Ferreira, Chair of Transparency International, Daniel Sabet from the Wilson Center, Daniel Alonso from Buckley LLP, former federal prosecutor. Thank you so much for these extraordinary insights. I think this was very helpful, not only in identifying the problem, which has become, unfortunately, very apparent, but identifying short-term and medium-term solutions to try to combat corruption more effectively in Latin America. And Dila, as you mentioned, this is a time where the results of that corruption are extremely apparent and heartbreaking in many cases, and very clearly affecting the public health in the region. So I think a moment where important to concentrate on this, and a moment where not only journalists, but the general public really recognize the importance of this discussion. My thanks again to Buckley LLP for its generous sponsorship of this important discussion. Please find this information and more relevant information on our website, wilsoncenter.org/LAP for Latin American program. We'll continue this conversation. We'll have the full recording of this, which we will distribute and make available on our website. Many thanks to you for watching and for contributing your questions. Stay healthy and safe, and please continue to engage with us on issues related to the impacts of COVID-19 in Latin America. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.